Recording in progress indeed. Okay, guys. So as you guys know, my name is Dr. Dean Fido, and I am a senior lecturer in forensic psychology at the University of Derby. My area of expertise is forensic psychology, but I'm involved in quite a lot of other things as well. Weird and wonderful history involving lots of things to do with violence, aggression, sexual behavior, but also some very much kind of nicer elements of psychology and forensic psychology as well, looking to improve the well-being of students, staff at university level, but also the general population and how we make the general population more aware of our forensic audiences. And also how we benefit the lives of many people that we work with on a daily basis. So throughout the seminar, we're going to explore the label of image-based sexual abuse and what it constitutes in terms of the behaviors. We're going to look at some of the present findings from some of our recent studies in terms of beliefs about revenge pornography, but also judgments of deepfake sexual media production, two elements which have been heavily in the news. And also we're going to set out an agenda for future research into image-based sexual abuse. Now, I realize that for the majority of the people watching this, especially on kind of the recording on YouTube, it's going to be content which is perhaps heavily psychology-based, but hopefully I present it in a way in which, even if you have no interest in psychology or forensic psychology, you'll be able to get some glean some sort of information out about it. So it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. So what is image-based sexual abuse? We like to call it a cluster or a constellation of behaviors, which are typically deviant in nature and typically have huge impacts on the general population, especially their victims, such as revenge pornography, which we're going to be talking about kind of for the majority of this presentation. Upskirting, taking indecent images underneath one's clothing. Cyber flashing, so you may have heard about this in the news, such under the definition of sending dick pics. And also deepfake media production, whereby you superimpose the image of one individual onto a naked image or a series of images of another individual. Now, even though we call it a constellation in the literature, Professor Claire McGlynn and colleagues call it a continuum. We don't like to call it a continuum because continuum suggests that there is a range. It goes from a kind of one side to a much more severe side. We like to think of every victim having a set story. So we call it a constellation, which kind of gives that umbrella term and gives everybody that equal level of impact. Revenge pornography, it's a complex bugbear of mine because, as we'll talk about in a second, the very definition is inappropriate. But it started off on a website called isanybodyup.com, whereby ex-partners, scorned lovers would post images of individuals which were perhaps, inappropriate, have lots of images associated with one another, their email addresses, the places that they work, etc., etc. And that's really obviously negative because it kind of gets your vulnerabilities, and everybody that you work with, your friends, family, see these images. And once an image is on the internet, once an image is live, it's very difficult to track. It's very difficult to chase down and ultimately prevent and stop. So this was a very devious website spurred on by lots of this element of revenge. In terms of revenge pornography in the media, it's in legislation rather, it's characterized by this disclosing of private sexual photos and films with the intent to cause distress to another individual. And within that, there's lots of kind of complex words. The first one, private material, which would not normally be made public, but as we see in quite a lot of the Western world, it's not always private, especially with kind of maybe more the rise of Instagram and lots of promiscuous images being shared. So that element of private kind of teeters quite a lot. The word sexual material, which exposes the genitals or contains content that a reasonable individual would consider to be sexual. That's obviously a lot more concrete terminology. But in total, when we go over to the term revenge pornography, we really hate this terminology. Revenge suggests that the core motivator for offending is actually a response to the misdemeanor of your ex-lover. And what that does is when we put the emphasis on the victim, it discounts any offending by non-ex-partners or people that are motivated to commit revenge pornography for other means, such as financial gain, coercion, notoriety, entertainment, or misogyny. So we've got a picture of Jennifer Lawrence here, and you know, historically, they were a victim of revenge pornography. They had their images drawn down from a cloud server. There was no interaction in terms of whether or not these images, you know, whether or not there's going to be any threat to disclose them. They were just disclosed. They were downloaded and shared. And obviously with that, there's no sort of revenge to do that. There was no sort of trying to get any monetary value. It was just done for entertainment purposes and to humiliate Jennifer. So instantaneously, we see that one of the core cases that has been in the media to do with revenge pornography isn't actually about revenge. The second term, pornography, this suggests that images have been generated as a consensual act between adults. Now, that might be the case initially in that one image was shared, you know, consensually. However, the consent was not there to redistribute that image. And that's really important. So, you know, and also it ignores any images that have been captured covertly. So it kind of negates that as well. So both the terms revenge and pornography are not ideal. When I use them throughout this lecture, it's basically just going to be to make it more connected to you, you know, and that you can connect yourself to the material. But just know from the outset that I think these two terms are abhorrent, and I would endorse you in your daily lives to try and stop using them. You know, is there a better terminology? Yes, the non-consensual distribution of sexual images, private sexual images. But for a lecture such as this, I can't keep saying those words. So bear with me, and we will just say revenge pornography for brevity. So if we look at laws, luckily now in the UK we do have laws, you know, that kind of do denote revenge pornography as being illegal. But if we look around the world, at least until the last year or so, different countries dealt with it quite differently. You know, we have Germany, which treated it as a data protection legislation or an act against art copyright. And exes can be asked to remove the images, but a failure to do so can result in a cease and desist or compensatory damages. The key take home from this is that it's not treated as a sexual offense. And when we talk about labeling, when you are a victim of sexual abuse, you know, instantaneously you think physical sexual abuse, but when you're a victim of sexual abuse, it donates quite a lot of impact. You know, people look at you in a particular way, and you can actually quite denote a lot of power that comes from that. However, if you say that you're a victim of a data protection, you know, briefing, then actually, you know, people care about that less, and they put less impact on you as a victim. The same kind of stems to France, which was covered by digital legislation. Yes, it did have sanctions up to 2 years imprisonment and quite a hefty fine, but still not a victim of sexual abuse. And in America, there are no federal laws. The 46 states to date have legislation against revenge pornography, but these very much differ. Many states require both intent and harm, you know, which can be quite difficult to prove, especially in the absence of any particular link to the perpetrator and the victim. So I think not having that federal legislation does make it excessively difficult, especially if you have interstate conflicts and the like. Israel was one of the first countries to really put their foot down with this. It got built into sexual harassment legislation. It was punishable by up to 5 years in prison. However, between 2014 and 2017, there were 643 cases. 84% were closed due to an unknown perpetrator. 108 cases made it to court. How many cases were convicted? 17, which just shows the way in which it's taken seriously and the way in which we can, you know, legislate against this. Much more needs to be done, and thankfully is being done. You're going to see this a lot more in the literature and legislation, you know, as we kind of go on. People do care about it a lot more. Moving on to upskirting, as we mentioned, this is operating equipment and or recording underneath the clothes of another person to observe genitals or buttocks without their consent, built into the Voyeurism Act of 2019. We're just doing some research on this at the minute, and actually we're using lots of the measures of voyeurism that have gone on in the past. You know, we're trying to map onto upskirting being a digital representation of voyeurism. And yes, this is conceptually similar to voyeurism, and it involves the covert observation of others in a state of undress. And we've known about this, for nigh on 25 years now, but only just legislating against it. Very kind of harrowing. Behavior typically viewed as an abnormality of sexual interest. Okay, so it's viewed to be deviant, but if we've known about it, or it's been in it's been in literature for 25 years, and it's only just being legislated against, that just show a disconnect, which is, very, very impactful and actually quite pervasive. Now, this came around fairly recently at the British Summertime Music Festival in the UK in London. July 2017, I was lucky enough to be at this concert. I believe the Red Hot Chili Peppers were headlining, but don't quote me on it. I was there at the same time. Gina Martin was there, and I've left a link here to the BBC News for any of you that can access this link. And it's quite a harrowing story. She was a victim of upskirting. She turned around. She identified this gentleman had taken these images. She went to the police, and the police said that he didn't actually violate any specific laws at the time. They could kind of do him under public decency legislation, but the caveat for this is that it requires 2 or more people to have witnessed the act for it to fall under public decency legislation. Now, the thing about upskirting is it's meant to be a covert act. And if it's meant to be a covert act, then the chances of being caught for this are extremely low. So much needed to be done. And thankfully, Gina Martin campaigned fearlessly. And this has now been written into legislation, at least in the UK. Obviously, laws wider afield do or do not exist. But this is something which I kind of guess is imperative, because it's something that, which, as we mentioned, has been kind of there sitting in the background known about for 25 years plus, but we are only just making strides now. So it just shows how perhaps such victims of image-based sexual abuse aren't being catered for as with some of the more physical elements of sexual abuse. Now, cyberflashing, this is the sending of unwanted, threatening or explicit sexual communications. Thankfully, in the UK, again, there's not illegal in its own right. However, over the next couple of years, it will be made illegal. There's lots of hard workers in the field, including myself and Professor Claire McGlynn from Durham University, are making strides forcing this into legislation. And so it will prevent the sending of so-called dick pics. Interestingly, over the last kind of decade, we've seen that 50% of college students and 41% of women aged between 18 to 36 have been victims, of such crimes. But I would argue that this is actually possibly a lot more. Lots of people might not want to disclose that they've received such images. And in fact, actually now, interestingly, there's particular groups on Twitter and Facebook whereby women who receive such images are then sharing them and trying to humiliate the person that sent them, ironically falling potentially into the revenge porn legislation itself. So there's a disconnect between how these individuals are helping to pacify their victimization and actually potentially becoming offenders in their own right. But again, it's not pornography. They're doing it to kind of try and stop that behavior. But I would argue that if this legislation is passed and it is efficient, then actually the behavior should stop regardless. But as we know, the internet is a very anonymous place, and so such actions can carry on. And how do we mitigate and protect against that? The question is, the answer is, I don't actually fully know, and more safeguards need to be put in place. So we turn our attention now to the final element of this constellation of behaviors, deepfaking. This is the use of machine learning techniques, so kind of high-powered computer programs which superimpose an image or a series of moving images onto the face or a motion picture of another, predominantly a porn actress or the like. Images are considered very difficult to distinguish from real life. And as we're now moving into kind of a state whereby we have access to higher kind of powers and uses on mobile phones, for example, we can actually do this via free apps. Okay, so we can make really impactful deepfake images, sexual or not, using free apps, which means it's applicable to a wide array of individuals. Delfino in 2019 suggested this could have huge political implications. including individuals accepting bribes, behaving unlawfully, or announcing impending terrorist attacks. Okay, so it is actually, again, these are kind of a set of lectures aimed at raising awareness and kind of garnering support for charities and whatnot, as Sophie has kind of announced. And so it's right at the forefront of our attention. However, Abram, a couple of years ago, said the most urgent threat at the minute is pornography. Okay, in fact, the impact it's having on potential victims. Deepfaking has been used for good, the bad, and the downright strange. Okay, so we was able to bring Princess Leia back into kind of new films. It's been used to impact actresses like Scarlett Johansson, who have been the victim of deepfake pornography. Okay, she says it's a lost cause in that you can have one video taken down and 5 more will pop up the day after. And it's been used for humorous purposes, such as Rowan Atkinson on Donald Trump's face there. It's a part of a video. The video has actually been taken down off of YouTube, but there's lots of other versions of that video dotted around. And actually, if you were interested, I would just suggest for you to put in kind of celebrity deepfakes in YouTube, not in Google itself, but in YouTube, and you will get humorous videos such as that. So the important thing with all our research is to look and see what's actually the impact of the victim. It can have 3 different types of consequences: social consequences, embarrassment, having that strain on the family and garnering kind of a poor reputation for the individual. It can have professional consequences, which map from those social consequences, such as having their employment terminated for damaging the organization's reputation. This was quite predominant a decade ago. And also health consequences, both mental health in terms of increased anxiety, depression, stress, but also elevated rates of suicide attempts and completions. There's a very predominant case of a young lady from Brazil, a 14-year-old girl actually, who took her own life, becoming a victim of revenge pornography. So very, very harrowing right there. In terms of the attitudes which we have, they're very, as a community, especially as a Western community, we're very victim blaming. Okay, so for example, the initial taking of the images, okay, so when they were sent in the first consensual manner, are perceived to be reckless, careless, or naive of the victim. Even though they are a victim, they're having this emphasis put upon them. Okay, individuals should be aware of the risk. So actually, perhaps they shouldn't be sending these images in the first place. It's their fault that they're setting themselves up to fail. And actually, when there is a breakdown of a relationship, Gavin and Scott showed that in 2019 that the general population think the responsibility actually lies with the victim to ensure the images are erased after the breakdown of a relationship, and actually not the other individual within that relationship to delete those images. And we might want to reflect back to our own perhaps relationships where we have or have not engaged in that behavior and what we have done with those images afterwards. So what I would like to say, though, is even though a lot of people do put the emphasis on the victim, that about their own safety engaging in sending sexual images, actually we would argue that sexting, okay, plays a core role in relationship building and also relationship maintenance. Now, we live in a world whereby we don't have to meet somebody down the pub or at a library or university to engage in a relationship with them. We can actually form relationships miles away, and this has been kind of amplified through obviously the advent of COVID and the experiences we've had over the last 3 years, whereby perhaps we've been looking for those external social connections. Tinder obviously helps with this quite a lot. And in terms of relationship building, it's a very fast-paced way of doing it. And also, we kind of need this when we're trying to build it into our complex and oftentimes fast-paced lifestyles as well. It's also important, though, that when we do talk about sexting, that we need to be aware that people are oftentimes coerced into sending and also receiving such images. And even though we do say that the focus should always be on the offender themselves, we have to acknowledge that when we do create and generate and disseminate these images of ourselves, it does increase our risk of victimization. And we just need to be aware of that. But that's definitely not to say that if images of us do get shared, that it is in any way our fault. We are just mathematically increasing our risk of victimization if those photographs exist. Leon, with a quick message in the chat, which I think we should answer now, is, does Twitter have a stance on sharing of indecent images? It seems rather unfiltered platform. So in their terms of services, I believe they've just recently updated them, Leon, actually, to be very kind of overt about this. However, we know that it is extremely easy to make a fake or anonymous account in Twitter. And so because of that ease, it largely goes unchecked. Now, I was actually speaking with a local member of parliament for Derby a couple of months ago before Christmas. And she was actually really interested in terms of saying, well, actually, what can we do in terms of protecting individuals who want to use social media? And at the end of the day, what we can do with our phones is we can turn off on all of the social media apps. We can turn off unwanted images or unwanted messages from people that we don't know. That's something that we can do. However, that's a very kind of victim focused perspective, right? In that actually the purpose of social media is, yes, it is onefold to engage in our local social circles, but actually as a professional who uses Twitter, I want to be able to welcome messages from people who perhaps want to collaborate with me, or welcome messages from people that want to share their story. I hear a lot of victims of revenge pornography, in quotes, wanting to get in touch with me. And so because of that, actually, I don't want to turn those settings off. And a female academic shouldn't want to turn those settings off, or a male or female, anybody shouldn't have to turn those settings off to avoid receiving such images. So yes, we all have the ability to stop that. However, anonymity and also actually preventing us using the platform to its full potential oftentimes are very impactful there. Now, Facebook also have been quite a lot in the news up to a decade or so ago in terms of fighting revenge porn cases. Images were shared quite a lot on Facebook, but thankfully now that's been reduced down quite a lot. There are kind of machine learning algorithms which identify images which have been flagged for being deviant in nature and oftentimes illegal, and they can be taken down automatically. But actually, you need the victims to be aware that they are, images of revenge pornography. And if they are, if they do kind of violate the terms of service, they need to be stripped. It kind of also maps onto pornography websites such as Pornhub.com, which have updated their terms of service to explicitly ban any kind of revenge pornography. But actually, how do you know if it is revenge pornography at all unless someone recognizes that they are a victim? So very, very interesting. And obviously, as we know, sometimes the captions that are used in pornography are there to entice viewers and might not actually dictate what the actual contents are. Say, for example, the stepbrother, stepsister dichotomy. Maybe these types of options should then be the default option with the option to enable. I definitely think so. We know that we are living in quite a naive world where we have perhaps generations who are using social media and using technologies that perhaps weren't brought up, weren't taught the safety elements of them. And so it is nice to actually, try and create that balance with them. And I think it's easy enough for people that do want to use it to turn it on. But again, it requires that complete shift of thinking. And also it requires a social media organization such as your Twitter, such as your TikTok, such as your Facebooks to say, okay, so actually we want to not let everybody use all of our functionality unless they turn it on. Whereas actually that can be a bit of a non-driving force for them. But I definitely take the point. Moving on to talking about some of the cultural beliefs and attitudes and how they link to image-based sexual abuse. And I'm conscious of the time as well. One thing that you guys may have heard of, and this is kind of, always in the media, always in the news, always in the literature, is this concept of a rape culture, in that certain behaviors, certain platforms encourage male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. Now, we hear this quite a lot. And yes, you know what, to some degree, this is true. We see lots of kind of advents in written, in spoken, in song media, which does kind of put the male as the aggressor in these relationships. And I know this differs by culture to culture. There's going to be lots of people looking back at this recording thinking, well, actually, does that map onto my culture? Just to take the quote from the far right here, it says they friend zoned me. That almost suggests that I have a right to have some sort of sexual relationship with that individual, and they've chosen they've chosen that it's not me. I'm not the lucky person, and they're going to put me in this friend zone. Okay, and that's the kind of ethos that we come across. However, what I would kind of argue is that typically what we see within the general population literature is that attitudes towards individuals with sexual convictions are incredibly negative. You know, there's broad support for long sentences, including in some cases the death penalty. There's widespread calls for the extensions to the violence and sex offenders registers. And in reality, there's very little explicit victim blaming for victims of sexual abuse. And so I would argue that actually, even though it's, you know, easy to kind of go down the, we have a history of this rape culture. I would argue, or we would argue, myself and my collaborator, Dr. Craig Harper from Nottingham Trent University, that overwhelmingly the general public is against any sort of individuals with sexual convictions or deviant sexual behavior. And that's important when we move on to some of the research which we have been doing. However, as I kind of mentioned, there are offence-supportive beliefs that may be held within particular groups. So, for example, a lot of you may have heard things such as this kind of rape mythology. You know, it's taught a lot at university level degrees. He didn't mean to, he's excusing the behaviour. You know, she may have lied. She may have lied. We don't want to believe her. It wasn't really rape. For example, if a woman doesn't have physically resist sex, even when she's protesting verbally, it doesn't necessarily need to be considered rape. Lots of these kind of potentially lack of education around consent are things which are normalized in discussion groups, within friendship groups, within popular media. I mean, it also kind of maps onto how people are dressed on night out. So if you're wearing a skimpy outfit, you know, she was asking for it. And I say with quotation marks, importantly. So even though we don't believe in a firm rape culture, we do acknowledge that this does exist in certain pockets of our environment. And so what we wanted to do in terms of our first study in this area was to develop a scale which we call the Beliefs About Revenge Pornography Questionnaire, to really denote whether or not people had pre-existing negative beliefs about victims of revenge pornography. Now, we worked with this with Dr. Lorraine Smith and some of our postgraduate students across Nottingham Trent University and the University of Derby. And the aim of this was to develop a non-gendered, wide-ranging measure of potential beliefs, myths, and attitudes about revenge pornography. Now, over the next few slides, you are going to see some statistics, but for those of you who aren't psychologists, and for those of you who are psychologists but hate statistics, luckily for you, you don't need to know what any of them mean, because I'm going to explain them to you very simply. We looked at several domains of interest: victim blaming, the characteristics of the victims, perpetrator characteristics, minimizing the effect. Okay, so it's not a big deal to share the images of an ex, especially if they cheated on you. Look to see whether people bought into revenge pornography being a crime, and also, I would argue most importantly, looked at how people viewed the effects and the harm that it did to the victims themselves. Now, a question in the chat, which is nothing that I can answer, so I will let Sophia answer that. And as we move on, we recruited our participants from a range of sources. For example, we looked at Reddit, and we looked at kind of all of the different areas of Reddit which really do help us, especially in this area, the love, the porn, the relationship subreddits to get their insight, and also lots of social media sites. We was able to get 511 participants, which is quite large, and the majority of them, albeit only just a majority, more or less 50% males and females, roughly around the age of 30 years, and quite an international sample with participants ranging from the UK, US, Canada, and Australia, to name key areas. We also looked at other measures such as belief in the just world, empathy, more deviant personality traits such as psychopathy, sadism, and also to see whether it mapped onto existing acceptance of rape mythologies. Now, you don't have to kind of care about the details on the screen, but what I do want to have the take-home messages are, we was able to identify 3 key subcomponents of our scale. The first one looked at the responsibility of the victims in terms of their victimization. The second one looked at some of the more sociological explanations, such as whether this was just a a uncontrolled pornography as a sexual offense. And we had a very kind of interesting question here in terms of whether or not the victim should be viewed just the same as a victim of physical sexual abuse, in this case, rape, which was a very kind of key marker for us in terms of helping with this distinction. So again, lots of statistics, but the only thing you really have to kind of have as a take-home message here is that overwhelmingly, individuals who had more perhaps deviant perceptions of life, such as individuals with high levels of psychopathy, high levels of narcissism, high levels of sadism, were more likely to view the victim as being responsible for their actions. They were also more likely to minimize the impact of revenge pornography on those victims. And interestingly, and this is something that I was actually interviewed by the BBC for last week just, was the take-home message that politics also has an impact on the way in which we view victims. So, for example, individuals who were more right-leaning, so those individuals that are more conservative values, were more likely to view the victim as being responsible if they had previously posted promiscuous images of themselves on the internet. However, left-leaning individuals, so those that are more kind of liberal in nature, were actually more likely to report that they would engage in such behavior. So a very kind of clear political distinction there, which we thought was exceptionally interesting. Obviously, individuals that have more levels of empathy were less likely to view victims as responsible. They were able to put themselves in the victim's shoes, and they were also more likely to report that revenge pornography should be seen as a sexual offense. So lots of kind of statistics there for individuals that are kind of psychologically kind of minded. You know, we have sadism predicting blame for victims. We have, if you view a victim as being responsible, you would put more blame on them, etc., etc. If you view the victim as being responsible, they were less likely to suggest that it was criminal in nature, because obviously that individual shouldn't have been making these mistakes, in quotation marks, in their life to begin with. And also, if the victim was seen to be responsible, then the viewer would say that they suffered less harm, you know, because actually it wasn't anyone else's fault. It was purely the victim's fault. And if it's the victim's fault, then it's a just world. You know, what happens to them is a repercussion of their own actions. And as such, you know, they're going to suffer less harm because of that. So very interesting ways in which we talk about people who have been victims of this abuse. The conclusion from this is that our measure appears to be a valid and reliable measure of social beliefs about revenge pornography, but importantly, it's not a myth scale. It's people's actual beliefs, and it's associated with meaningful outcomes as well. So moving on quite quickly to look at some of the other research which we've conducted in this area. We've also looked at the notation of intrasexual competition. So how I see myself as an alpha male, and therefore I want to remove the resources of other males so I can compete for predominantly females. You know, and we see some very interesting trends in terms of our empathy maps onto whether or not we see victims as actual victims, you know, whether we can support the harm that's being done to them, which is quite interesting research in a very high impact journal. But one of our kind of, I would say, stolid and kind of like key take home papers is our very recent research in the area of deepfake pornography. Now, this has been published with my collaborator, Craig Harper, as I mentioned, but also one of my postgraduate students, Yaya Rayo, who is now at Edinburgh. And we set out to explore the judgments of deepfake pornography as a function of sex, the victim's status, whether they were just your average Joe on the street or whether they was a celebrity, and also our intended use of those images. We gave our participants a vignette, so a very short story in terms of what it's like to be, you know, a victim, and how we kind of wanted to have a sexual relationship with somebody, but we couldn't quite strike up that sexual relationship. So we wanted to generate images of them and use them for kind of our own pleasure almost. And there's an example of that in the bottom here. And we found some really interesting results across two independent studies. So in the first study, we found that psychopathy, you know, so that deviant behavior in ourselves, predicted somebody's likelihood to make and distribute these sexual images. Secondly, we also looked at victim sex, which was really interesting. We found that relative to female victims, regardless of whether they were celebrities or your average Joes, male victims were viewed to be less impacted by being a victim of deepfake pornography. Likely maps onto, well, men send explicit pictures of themselves anyway, so they obviously don't mind being kind of victims of such crimes. Interestingly, we see that if we compare non-celebrities to actual celebrity hypothetical victims, then the general public think that it's a lot more impactful, it's a lot more dangerous, it's a lot more severe when the hypothetical victim is not a celebrity versus when they are a celebrity. And that maps onto a lot of the sociological literature in terms of how we distance ourselves from celebrities and how we view them to be almost higher beings than us. And perhaps they might deserve what happens to them because we are a little bit jealous of their success. The kind of third take home, which is actually number 2 here, is that out of all of the participants that we talked about deepfake pornography, only 6% of them were actually able to name deepfake pornography as what we were talking about. And that's really impactful because it shows that even though this is happening to celebrities and also the general population widely, it's not actually recognized. People aren't discussing it enough. The second part of our study tried to move on to see whether or not it mattered how the images were being shared or not. We saw that significantly greater harm as a function of sharing the images versus creating our own images. So actually, people thought it was worse if we shared them than if we just created them for our own personal use. But also, again, lesser harm was perceived if it was a celebrity victim versus one of our friends or a stranger who wasn't a celebrity. So again, it puts this emphasis on we don't care what happens to celebrities. We see them as totally separate social entities to ourselves. In the second major finding, we saw that individuals that were attracted to females, as opposed to individuals that are attracted to males, were less likely to create and or share deepfaked images. Now, this is really interesting because what this suggests is that predominantly female individuals within our sample were more likely to create and share images than males were. A finding that definitely needs replicating, but an interesting finding nonetheless. And interestingly, even more so, in this second study, only 4% of our population were able to actually name deepfake pornography. And we're especially proud of this study because it got published in the Journal of Computers and Human Behavior, which is a tier 1, but even more so journal. It's a very, very impactful journal. So we're excessively happy about this paper. So where are we taking our research in the future? There's about 3 or 4 different ways, which I'm very briefly going to talk to you for. The first one is cross-cultural comparisons. Now, we're going to have lots of people viewing this video from different cultures, and I welcome the discourse. So please do email me about it. In a personal communication I had with a lady from Saudi Arabia, she said that if she was a victim of revenge pornography and she had her sexual images shared, then it would be her that would be reprimanded by her family and society, which, as we viewers in the West, that's quite difficult for us to comprehend. Okay, so we need to understand more about some of these cultural barriers that are stopping people discussing their own victimization. Because if we are seeing people not able to, get to where they need to be in terms of disclosing victimization, then how are we ever going to help these individuals? And we know that a lot of beliefs and views about sex and sex-related crimes are entwined with religion and family values as well. So it's about how we tease that apart and help everybody and not render people lonely and, and not with help. The message that I was going to pass over to Sophia, it's actually only just come to me. It's kind of a direct message to me. So I will send that over to Sophia afterwards as well, and hopefully she can send you some information back on that. I've only just noticed that. Deepfake is a scary area, as this technology is still in its infancy and yet hard to, 100%. I mean, the sheer fact that we can make very well-placed videos from our mobile phones is the scary part, because actually there's people there with massive computer, energy that can really tease that apart. And so that's, that to me is very much one of those scary elements. I would completely agree, especially as it can be used for, to kind of drive war and potential terrorism as well, and kind of political affiliations. That to me holds quite a lot of danger that I think needs to be spoken about and needs to be made more aware of. Future directions number 2. Informing a model of offending. So at the minute, we don't really know why people do this. We've got some information from our psychological research, but as we know, offending behavior is generated from biological contributions, the social contributions, and also our kind of core psychological contributions that interact on a kind of a daily basis. And so we need to put together a working framework to help explain why people do move in to offending behavior. And that's work which is yet to be done. And also look at, again, going back to reducing those barriers for victims to come forward. Now, we know that there are kind of helplines out there for individuals, but from those helplines, they report that people are fearful. They look at their past experiences by being victims, the past experiences they've had with the police service. They don't want to be re-victimized. We know that revenge porn images are just out there. You know, it's very difficult to delete them. They get shared, they get downloaded, uploaded elsewhere, given different names. It's very difficult to track once these images are out there and available. Might be worried about being disbelieved by either the police or their family and their friends, you know, and also the impact of the family. They don't want to bring shame on their family. They don't want that repercussions from their family. Okay, so we need to work with these networks and develop a discourse surrounding being a victim and what that means and how people can empower themselves from that victimization. And also in terms of kind of one of our final future directions is work that I'm doing with Dr. Dominic Petronzi from the University of Derby, where we need to develop education around what it means to be a victim of revenge pornography and how we normalize sexting, you know, within our kind of younger relationships, but also to educate parents, teachers, caregivers in terms of the potential impact. Now, this is really important because we are seeing that sexting is becoming prevalent within school-aged individuals, but the creation and the dissemination and the consistent sharing afterwards of these private sexual images can render somebody to become implicit in the creation and dissemination of child exploitation material. Some of you viewers might, or listeners, might be kind of acquainted with the terminology child porn or kiddie porn. We don't like that terminology because you can't possibly have child pornography. It doesn't exist because you need that element of consent, which children can't give. However, you do become kind of implicit in that if you do create and share those images yourself. So we do need to be teaching school-aged children, that level of detail. A note in the chat, Louis Frew did a recent episode on the porn industry and the victimization of actresses. While not directly related to revenge pornography, it touched on consent, saying yes, might not be necessarily be consent, as it needs to have some weight behind it. Completely agree. This might particularly be because of how different acts start to happen after the contract has been signed. Yes, and actually, I don't know. I don't know if I've got it or it's in a different room. I think it's in a different room. But I recently got a book sent to me on, I think it was just called Porn Work. It's a very fluorescent pink cover. And basically it's a series of interviews with people, porn actresses, porn actors, directors, cameramen, lighting, etc., sound people in the porn industry. And it does delve into subjects like that. And I think it's really important to be teaching people about consent, but also the limitations of that consent, because consent can be withdrawn. It is a constant process, which lots of people obviously don't kind of understand, agree with, or note. All of this information kind of wrapped up into a recent book that I authored with my collaborator, Craig Harper, 2 years ago now, it seems. 2 whole years. And we do welcome any people to come forward with collaboration ideas or questions, comments. And that's the book published in Palgrave there. Why are there different legislation about sexual? Why are there differences in legislation about sexual harassment? Is it because of moral relativism? That's a great question, and it's actually something I don't really know. I think it takes a lot to change laws. I think you need to have the public on side to change laws. You need to be coming from a set perspective. You need to have the right people informing those laws as and when you are coming up with them and generating them. So myself, I've been involved in the new domestic abuse legislation, and I'm coming at it from a very particular angle of image-based sexual abuse. And I kind of guess if you don't have the right people around you during the consultancy time, then actually the laws can only be what the advisors dictate them to be. You know, when those laws and those perceptions are going to change year on year and year on year. And so if you don't have people kind of supporting that at the time, then that might lead to those elements of differences. Then you also have different cultural differences. You also have different country differences. But yeah, in terms of the moral relativism, I think there is a lot of kind of moral outcry. Going back to what I was saying right at the start in terms of how people view individuals with sexual convictions. It's very difficult to change legislation around that unless you're kind of going for something more punitive because of that outcry. You know, people very much kind of have deep ingrained views of this. So yeah, very interesting question. And that would be my best guess. But honestly, I don't fully know, if I'm being honest. And so yeah, that brings us to the end of the kind of presentation today, everyone. Like, thank you very much for popping by. If there's any more questions, please do feel free to chuck them into the chat now. But other than that, you know, this is a joint work between myself and Dr. Craig Harper. I'm at the University of Derby. Dr. Craig Harper is at Nottingham Trent University, and we collaborate on lots of image-based sexual abuse related research. And yeah, I think it's something which we do hold very dear to our heart. As I mentioned, we were interviewed for the BBC just last week to give our opinions on what they're doing a documentary on in terms of I think they call them collectors, so individuals that are just there collecting images of revenge pornography. It's an area which very much hasn't been looked into yet, and I think which does deserve more attention. What's your take on sexualization online and how it impacts the victim who is just posting a normal picture? Now, that's really interesting. We've all heard of the adage that sex sells, and I think, you know, to a certain extent, that's very much true. Whether or not we should kind of extrapolate that to everyone who posts provocative pictures online, you know, I think the media, the way in which we're brought up, cultural values, all has an impact on how we perceive sexualization and the sexualization that we put on other individuals as well. And I think that to a certain extent, you know, it's okay, but to a larger extent, it's not. And I think the extremes that we're going to now means that it's very difficult to post a picture on social media without that element of sexualization being really overtly coming through. And there are very few positives. You know, I mean, there are obviously individuals that make livings out of that. I'm very much a advocate of, I'm pro sex industry. You know, I'm pro OnlyFans creators, etc. But equally, I think that there is kind of that moral standpoint in terms of lots of people do have opinions on how people dress and how they portray themselves, probably opinions that they have no right to have, almost, if that makes sense. Do you think there's a way to combat this or monitor it other than social media regulations? Honestly, I would say that we are vastly past anything that needs to happen now. I was speaking to my collaborators the other day in terms of saying that actually a lot of the research that we do now, I'm getting to the stage where I say, so what? You know, so what? It seems that this information is only really going to come across to individuals who perhaps have that, I would say, more critical elements of thinking and deeper thought, whereas a lot of things are already ingrained to people at such a young age. And so I firmly believe that we need to go back to school, literally, and remaster the way in which things such as consent, remaster the way in which we teach cultural values or values at all, remaster the way in which we talk about relationships, how we teach people how to break up from those relationships. Because as soon as it gets to your first thought is, oh, I'm in a breakup situation, so I'm going to share these indecent images of people, you know, across the world. As soon as it gets to that stage, you've gone too far. We need to be educating people on, yes, breakups are emotionally driven. And we do have this very powerful, impactful, pervasive emotion going through us during those breakups. But actually, how do we put that in a positive spin? How do we share, how do we avoid sharing those images and actually have a more mutual and successful breakup, and all of these things just aren't taught, and that stems and extrapolates itself to how we therefore view people online. Like on a wider context, you can so Chad, that message comes directly to me, so it doesn't go to Sophia, so you might have to send that to her separately. So yeah. No, I mean, maybe via email, perhaps. So yeah. So I honestly don't think that that's possible for us to. I just don't think that's possible for us to, and it does extrapolate onto the way in which we view and see people, and that needs to change from a very kind of educational level, very much so. So yeah. Any additional questions, please do let me know. But regardless, as before, you guys can see. I mean, if you're a University of Derby student, you can obviously email my work address. But if you're not, feel free to email either myself or Craig in terms of looking at some of our existing work, or just asking us questions about this current kind of dialogue. As I say, it's something that we hold deep into our. What got us onto the topic? If I'm being honest, it was something that, so personally, I've had a couple of friends that have been victimized in terms of having their images shared around workplaces. But also when I do my research, I look at topics, and this is why my research portfolio is so wide, is that I look at topics whereby I can hopefully make a change, make a timely change. And this is very much an area of research, which at the time we started, I think late 2018, it was very much something that perhaps I hadn't really hadn't really kind of gone through the hoops with, and there was lots of research to be done, and Craig and I thought that we can make a real big dent in this area, especially because lots of the literature which was coming out was from more of a sociological lens in terms of how people were talking about this and the rhetoric, and there's lots of kind of interview based elements to do with so-called revenge pornography, whereas we kind of move that to look at perhaps the psychological impacts and predictors of our views and perceptions of revenge pornography. Does alcohol play a role in risky sexual behavior? So yes, it does. We know that from the kind of behavioral literature. We know that from the kind of sex offending literature that alcohol, substance abuse is, or individuals with sexual convictions literature. We know that alcohol, substance abuse, inability to control oneself during those periods predicts deviant sexual behavior, risky sexual behavior. It's not been mapped onto actual behavioral indices of revenge pornography, but you can imagine that it extrapolates fairly easily, right? In that not only are you more likely to take the provocative images and share them, but you might also, any sort of qualms you have with disseminating those images, you might be kind of breaking down those barriers and be more likely to disseminate them in the future. But that would just be a hypothesis. I don't think there's any current literature out there, at least that I know of, that could lead to people sharing to a greater degree. But a very interesting way of kind of thinking about that, but also very difficult, I would suggest, very difficult way in which we could measure that. Perhaps I don't really know how that research would pan out. Individual sexual convictions are highly stigmatized in society. Is it difficult to reintegrate this population involved in the criminal justice system? 100%. We know there's lots of kind of so kind of talking about sexual offending more broadly. We know that it's very difficult to foster rehabilitation. I published a paper with a postgraduate student called Megan Rothwell last year, whereby we looked at people's judgments, in terms of whether or not they were more likely or less likely to want to support the rehabilitation and reintegration of individuals with sexual convictions into the general population. And they were very much negative about doing that. And I think, again, that comes down to a lack of education. We need to think as academics, and we need to think as students of forensic psychology, perhaps, that we're in a very privileged position, whereby we're privy to a lot of this kind of information, and we're privy to a lot of the knowledge which perhaps the general population do have access to, but which they don't access in a meaningful way. So you're very unlikely to have people, seeking out such information. So it's our role as individuals with interest in forensic psychology to actually teach and disseminate a lot of that information in a meaningful way, which could garner support. Is there any protection laws around psychological abuse, torment, or is it just too much of a grey area? Very much a grey area. I think the closest we would have is mapping onto domestic abuse legislation. We know that recent domestic abuse bills have been passed. And I think a lot of it maps down to the intent to cause distress, which may or may not always be apparent, may not always be kind of, we might not always be able to evidence it. And so in my kind of other professional arm, I'm one of the co-chairs of the European Research Committee of the Aftermath Surviving Psychopathy Foundation, which is a mouthful, but essentially what we're looking at there is to look at sexual coercion within relationships and the impact that has on the victims and how helpful it is to identify that. I've got a PhD student starting with me next year, fingers crossed for September, who is looking at sexual coercion specifically in domestic relationships and how that might be predicted by elements of psychopathy, so-called successful psychopathy, which is where people who perhaps aren't breaking any laws, but they're excellent at manipulating people, and the kind of bridging between the manipulation and the actual sexual abuse within these relationships, which obviously maps onto your question earlier on about the psychological abuse and that torment. When it comes to the same-sex rape, a sexual offence from forced homosexuality, I couldn't possibly comment. I've got no idea. I think the focus obviously is revenge pornography for the purpose of this seminar, but I don't have any perceptions of. I can't talk about laws I don't know anything about. So yeah. So if anyone has any kind of final questions in terms of revenge pornography or image-based sexual abuse specifically, feel free to ask them. But I kind of guess I'd just like to close by just thanking everyone really for kind of the great attention. Obviously, one of the main purposes of this is to kind of make psychology more accessible to the wider population. And Sophie is doing an excellent job of garnering support for Ukrainian refugees and associated charities. She's done an excellent job of raising money so far, and I think she'll be kind of supplementing this video with links to affirmed and regulated charities, which are very much helping to support those pathways. So feel free to share this link once it comes out, and especially if you're already watching on YouTube, just click that share button. Follow Sophia for kind of more interesting lectures like this. I know she's doing quite a lot of them in Russian as well to kind of share that ethos and to kind of garner a lot more knowledge. And I think my take home is we have a lot of specialist knowledge, and there's no point us safeguarding this knowledge and sitting in kind of ivory towers with this knowledge or putting it behind paywalls for people not being able to access. So I do hope that we can disseminate psychology-based knowledge to the general population as a means of not only educating people, but also garnering a lot of support for the great work which we as academics, but also kind of people in related fields are doing, especially when it comes to lending support for legislative change and the like. So perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for kind of your attention if you are kind of live with us, and also for people who's watching this on the YouTube video. Make sure to drop me an email and just let me know that you've taken the time to kind of watch the video. You know, if it's been interesting to you, if you've learned anything, please do let me know. I love all of the support. So thank you very much, everyone. Have an awesome evening, and I will hopefully catch you all very soon. Okay, guys. Bye-bye.